This is Heidi Burgess. Today I want to talk about prospective reconciliation, which is my term for looking ahead and trying to figure out how you're going to live with the group you're in conflict with, and what the goal is that you're looking for as you work towards reconciliation. Again, I want to start with a little bit of history. When I first started teaching about reconciliation, I used a rocket metaphor and suggested that there were stages. The first stage started with peacekeeping and peacemaking, which set the stage for reconciliation, even though they weren't part of it. The second stage was retrospective reconciliation, which was looking backwards and seeking the truth of what happened and obtaining justice. Stage 3 was looking forward, prospective reconciliation, forging a positive view of the future. And then stage 4 was working on small scale, and stage 5, large scale implementation. But I was always a bit uneasy with this metaphor, because humans are complex and rockets are simply complicated if you're using the terms as they're used in complexity theory. So I changed metaphors to a baking metaphor, which also isn't exactly complex, but it is more flexible. So instead of having stages that have to go in a particular order, you have ingredients that can be added in different orders. And you can change ingredients, and you can change the amount of the ingredients. So there's a lot more flexibility in what you might do. But then I heard Ibrahim Rasool speak at PeaceCon 2020, where he said, start with the end. And by that he meant that we in the United States should do what blacks did in South Africa, where they started with an image of where they wanted to get to. In South Africa, that was the notion that South Africa belonged to everyone who lived there. So that defined their goal and what they were working toward. And they started to work on developing the processes and the structures that would allow that vision to come about. So while I say that the order is flexible, after hearing that talk, I decided to switch what I called the ingredients in my recipe of reconciliation. So now I say that ingredient 2 is prospective reconciliation, and ingredient 3 is retrospective reconciliation. And I argue that reconciliation is much more likely to succeed if one switches the order in this way. That's consistent with a line that I often use when I'm teaching, which is that you can't get somewhere if you don't know where you're going. So it makes a lot of sense to me to figure out what reconciliation is, what the goal is that you're trying to reach, before you start trying to reach it. But how do you do that? Do you do it alone? Or do you do it together? And if you do it together, with whom? Well, if you believe what Rasool said, we should be doing it with everyone who lives here. Now, I'm aware of the fact that that's quite controversial. For a start, it implies that all those who entered the U.S. illegally should be allowed to stay. There's a lot of people, obviously, who would not be happy with that notion. But beyond that, there are many people on both the left and the right politically that believe that their values, their priorities, their ideas about right and wrong are correct. They're the truth. And the only way that they would be willing to reconcile with people who think otherwise is if those people agreed to the other side's truth. And if they don't, reconciliation can't happen. Now, we're going to have a very hard time agreeing on one truth as long as people get their news from their preferred news media, which spin the news however they see fit, to please their audiences. The result is very, very different worldviews and very different images of right and wrong. So I argue that until we can come up with an agreement about one truth, one right and wrong, we're heading to what might be called a Category 5 socio-political hurricane. That's true here in the US, and the same is true elsewhere as well. Of course, the situation in the United States has been bad for quite some time. We got a small image of how bad it might yet get on January 6th, when right-wing protesters supporting Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol, which, up until that day, I would think almost everybody in the United States would think was completely unimaginable. But now it's real, and apparently it has been used quite successfully as a recruitment tool for those right-wing groups. Even worse, they apparently see the Capitol attack as a great success, which reinforces the idea that violence is a way to accomplish one's goals. That is not likely to end well. So that's what makes me say we really have no choice. We can go down the road to the Category 5 hurricane, or we can go in the other direction to calmer waters. Now notice, I don't have a picture of a completely still body of water. There's waves in that picture on the right side, but they're small. We want to move to a place where there still is conflict and there still is disagreement, because those are never going to go away. But we want them to be handled in manageable ways. When we design policies from one side only, we get continuing polarization and strife. We've tried doing that several times in the past. Obama, for instance, pledged to be a president for all the people. But then he pursued his agenda without the cooperation of the right. Now, this wasn't entirely his fault. It was his only choice, really, because the Republicans' goal, as I saw it, was rather than solving problems or governing, it seemed that they wanted to just block anything Obama tried to do, even if he tried to do something that, if a Republican had proposed the same thing, they might have been for it. So I don't think it was Obama's fault. But it doesn't matter. It still drove polarization. Then we got Trump, who never had any intention of cooperating or listening to or treating the left with anything but contempt. So polarization keeps on rising and rising, and we're heading straight towards that Cat 5 hurricane. Now, if we want to try the other road, it's important to note it's not a smooth one like that road on the left. It looks more like the road on the right. It's really tough going. But we have the knowledge, we have the tools, and we have the experience to pull it off. Let me explain what I mean. First, there's lots and lots of knowledge available on how to resolve conflicts effectively, how to engage in reconciliation projects effectively, how to get people with very disparate interests and goals and needs to cooperate and work together. This is what you're learning about at the Carter School. This is what they teach at Harvard's program on negotiation. This is what all 10,000 or 20,000 articles on beyond intractability are all about. The knowledge is out there. We don't have to invent it from scratch. We also have the tools. For instance, the Constitution has already addressed a lot of things that we're fighting about. And despite that many people complain about how it's outdated, and some even say it's fundamentally evil in the first place, I would argue that it still has a great deal of value. Consider the Bill of Rights, the 13th Amendment which abolished slavery, The 14th Amendment assured due process. The 15th Amendment prohibited the denial of the right to vote on the basis of race or former condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment gave the women the right to vote. All of these amendments have corrected errors that were made in the original Constitution, and they've made it better. And we can correct our errors and make it better still. But it remains the bedrock foundation of our rule of law, which was gravely challenged over the last 4 years, but it was ultimately what saved our democracy, at least this time. Along with the Constitution, the courts and Congress are also very important to upholding and evolving our rule of law. Despite Trump packing the courts with conservative judges from the Supreme Court on down, when it came to asserting the rule of law was more important than politics, all of the courts that heard election cases, over 70 of them, held firm upholding the rule of law. And that preserved U.S. democracy. So our institutions may have flaws. Most of them exhibit institutional racism, and we need to improve them. But we have a good platform on which to build, and we can do that. That's not always the case in deeply divided societies, especially those that are emerging from authoritarian regimes or civil wars. Conflict resolvers also know that legal mechanisms have a lot of problems, and that informal mechanisms such as mediation, which is what that lower right icon is supposed to indicate, produce superior outcomes in many situations. And we have many thousands of people who are trained in mediation in this country. So we have the ability to scale up to mediate many more conflicts with our knowledge and our tools. And lastly, we have lots of experience. This is just an example of 3 very experienced organizations that help people come together across divides and work out their differences. There are many, many more. Search for Common Ground is the largest peace-building organization in the world, which is working in over 30 countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and now the USA. And it's been doing so since 1982. Its founder, John Marks, founded Search to, in his words, introduce a new concept. We all win when the focus is on what we want to achieve, not on what divides us. Now, he didn't mean that line in this way, but a second interpretation of those words is that we should look at first to our goals, in other words, start with the end, before we look at our past, which is what divided us, and what we did when we were so divided. As I said, that view is debatable, but in my mind it holds merit, for the same reason that John Marks originally spoke those words. Focusing on commonality takes us farther than focusing on difference. The second organization, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, NCDD, is actually an umbrella organization, which brings together over 700 organizations and individuals who do dialogue and deliberation in the United States and beyond. And finally, Essential Partners, which used to be called the Public Conversations Project, was founded in 1989 with the goal of equipping people to live and work better together in community by building trust and understanding across differences. To do that, they've facilitated thousands of dialogues, first starting with abortion and continuing on to many other very deep-rooted intractable conflicts in the U.S. and abroad. And although they didn't frame what they did in terms of reconciliation per se, I'd argue that the goal of building trust and understanding across difference is, indeed, working towards reconciliation. So these 3 are 3 of my favorite examples of organizations with experience, but there's many, many more, probably thousands. One other organization that I want to mention here is the Common Ground Network for Life and Choice. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was an offshoot of Search for Common Ground, which I just talked about, and it ran abortion dialogues in the 1990s. Beyond Intractability contributor Michelle Barron and Nikki Karstafen evaluated their work and published an article about it in the Negotiation Journal in 1997. There they had an interesting observation. They said that reconciliation is usually seen as one of the last conflict resolution processes. It is out at the right side of that standard conflict stages bell curve, after peacemaking, after peacekeeping. But they observed that occasionally, emotional issues will block even entry into negotiation. That might be especially true, they said, when deeply held values and beliefs are central to a conflict. It's not only true for abortion, it's true for all of the kinds of conflicts that we're looking at today in the United States and around the world that are so gravely in need of reconciliation. They revolve around deeply held values and beliefs. They have strong emotional issues. So I buy into the argument that reconciliation needs to be much higher up that bell curve of stages than it is traditionally. Similarly to the Public Conversations Essential Partners work on abortion, Common Ground Network's goals were understanding and fostering intergroup civility and coexistence. They were the same in that respect. But the Common Ground Network went further than Essential Partners by having a third goal of acting together when it furthers overlapping interests and values. PCP was careful, at least in the early days when I was more familiar with their work than I am now, to completely avoid the words common ground. One of the founders, Laura Chasin, felt that those words scared people away because, she said, they had no interest in finding common ground with the other. But if you read descriptions of their dialogues or listen to some of those descriptions, we have interviews with some of the founders, including Laura Chasin, Bob Staines, and Sally Ann Roth on Beyond Intractability, you'll learn that the people who participated in those dialogues often did indeed find common ground, as well as understanding of and respect for the other. So while they may not say their goal is reconciliation, that is what both of these organizations were and still are doing in the case of Essential Partners. And they provide an example of expertise that we already have in how to do this. We also have plenty of expertise in goal setting and future visioning. One notable example of this is the Cincinnati Police Community Relations Collaborative. That was designed and carried out by a colleague of ours, Jay Rothman. It took place in the early 2000s after there were some police shootings in Cincinnati, and there were tensions between the police and the community that are very similar to the relations between police and communities that we saw over the summer after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. Jay started with what he called an action evaluation process, which actually was a process that looked not only backwards to examine what happened, truth in Lederach's conception of reconciliation, but it brought the whole community together, leaders and grassroots, to visualize how they wanted to see police-community relations working in the future. The Cincinnati Collaborative was a very intense, long-running process, but similar shorter yet successful processes have been undertaken by members of the Community Relations Service, which is an arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. They've been trying to help communities heal racial conflicts since their formation with the Civil Rights Act in 1964. If you're interested, Beyond Intractability Civil Rights Oral History Project has transcriptions of extensive 6-hour interviews that we held with leading CRS mediators in the early 2000s. While these are now fairly old, they teach lessons about how to reconcile racial conflicts that are still very valid today. One of the tools that they used was getting all the stakeholders to sit down and envision a future that would be appealing to all of the disputants, the police and the community, blacks, whites, everybody who was involved in the current conflict. And finally, I want to talk about Sierra Leone's Citizen Manifesto. I didn't know anything about that until I watched a video that Shamal Idris shared with me earlier this week. Shamal is CEO of Search for Common Ground. There's a link to this video in the reference section so you can watch it yourself if you want to. He and his wife Cynthia, who's an expert on violent extremism, were interviewed in CNN about their work and how it related to the violence we just experienced in the U.S. on January 6. I'd like to read the section of that interview that relates to what we're talking about here. He said, in Sierra Leone, after a civil war that tore that country apart, and in the lead up to an election that promised to be just as fractious as the one we just had here, if not worse, the citizens of that country joined together in the largest coalition of civil society organizations in the country's history as a united front, and they said to all of the political parties that you all have your political platforms, but we have developed a Citizens Manifesto with 7 demands, and no matter who wins, we want to see you do these things in the first 100 days. They went to basic things like financial transparency and women in the cabinet, things that a vast majority across political dividing lines, the majority of Sierra Leone citizens could agree to. And then he went on. We as Americans can do absolutely the same thing. But we need to start now. We need to start forging that common ground now. The need is urgent and the choice is in front of us. Other countries have done it, and so can we. I heard him say the choice is in front of us, and that brought me right back to the forking road image that I showed before. And when he said other countries have done it, so can we, that reminded me of Kenneth Boulding's first law. Kenneth Boulding was one of the founders of the field that was at the University of Colorado for quite a while, where Guy was a graduate student working with him. And he was also at George Mason University after he was at CU. And he formulated his first law, if it exists, it must be possible. When economists were observing that inflation and recession were happening at the same time, but they wouldn't admit that because economic theory at the time says that couldn't happen. So they were trying to explain away reality. And he was arguing, if it exists, then it must be possible. Don't try to change reality. Change your theory. Indeed. The same thing can be said about Sierra Leone. If it exists, it must be possible. So that means if they did it there, Shamal was right. We can do it here. It's possible. So far, all of this talk has been about process, so I want to spend just a few more minutes talking about substance. It seems to me that one of the things that people really need to focus on when they're trying to define what would allow people to live successfully together is John Burton's focus on human needs. Like Kenneth Boulding, John Burton was another early founder of the field who was at George Mason for quite a while. And he focused on the centrality of human needs in deep-rooted intractable conflicts. He built on Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of fundamental human needs, which is what's shown here, but he pulled out 3 needs in particular that he said related to deep-rooted conflicts. These were identity, security, and recognition. Burton maintained that when individuals or groups do not have those 3 needs fulfilled, deep-rooted, often violent conflict was inevitable. And the only way to end those conflicts was to fulfill those needs. So I would argue that one key aspect of reconciliation has to be respecting everybody's identity, not just the winners, assuring everybody's security and giving them recognition for who they are and their accomplishments. One other Kenneth Boulding idea that's important here is his peaks and Mesa theory. He had lots of theories. Boulding pointed out that the goal of a peacemaking process, and I would say a reconciliation process too, should not be perfection when everything is worked out perfectly to all sides' satisfaction, because for a start that would be impossible. Rather, Boulding said the goal should be an agreement and implementation of that agreement that is good enough to avoid cliffs or catastrophes. Using his metaphor, anywhere on the top of the mesa is fine. You don't have to climb to the very summit. The important thing is you don't want to fall off the cliff. Mixing metaphors, you don't want to fall into that Category 5 hurricane. That relates to an idea I should have put in the introductory video about reconciliation, but I forgot to. That is that reconciliation is a continuum. It's not a duality. So it's not a choice between full reconciliation and total war, or even full reconciliation and extreme polarization, fear, distrust, hatred, and violence, which is where I saw the U.S. being on January 6, and probably we're still there now. How far Biden will be able to move us to the right on this diagram remains to be seen. But that's the direction he's trying to move us. And I argue if he just gets us out top of the mesa, not to the top of the Matterhorn, that will be a great accomplishment. Another example of the peace and mesa theory that relates to what we're talking about here is the approach that Guy and I took with our co-editor Paul Ware when we wrote an edited book entitled Justice Without Violence. We wrote it because we added an introductory and a final chapter, but there were about 15 other authors who submitted chapters that were all looking at ways to obtain justice using nonviolence instead of violent strategies. Before we started writing, we got all the authors together and we tried to decide what we meant by justice. And after several hours of debate, we still couldn't agree. So we decided to bring in some experts, some philosophers, to tell us what justice was. Well, that didn't work. That just got us bogged down even more because we found out philosophers don't agree either on what justice is. Arguing about such things endlessly seemed to me to be their bread and butter. So we finally decided to use Boulding's peak and mesa theory. Rather than deciding on the perfect definition of justice, the peak, we found it was easy to agree on what injustice was. Slavery, taking away people's homes, herding them onto reservations, putting them in internment camps, concentration camps, re-education camps, genocide, gross inequality of income and wealth. We all could agree that those things were unjust. So despite the title of the book, we decided to look at how to eliminate gross injustice without using violence. That was the Mesa approach. I mention this here because it holds an important lesson for those seeking justice now in the United States. Just today I read an article in the New York Times entitled "Charlottesville Inspired Biden to Run. Now it has a message for him." And in the subtitle it said, "Now, as President Biden calls for national unity, residents of Charlottesville say it requires accountability first." I've heard this echoed by many people who call for justice before considering peace or mercy. No doubt, justice in some form is essential for reconciliation. That form may indeed include accountability as demanded in the article. But I would advise that justice advocates look for the Mesa top, not the summit of the mountain, especially when it comes to justice, and consider how justice needs to be combined with truth, peace, and mercy to obtain reconciliation. How much of each should be included? What order should these be added? This is out of the scope of this video, but we'll be talking more about it later. So, in sum, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, we have the experience. And according to Boulding's first law, we know that reconciliation is possible. So it seems to me it's time to go. It's time that we gather up our knowledge, our tools, and our experience and head out on that bumpy, rutted road. If we do, instead of a hurricane, we might just find beautiful, calming water ahead. Thanks.